Continuing Lucullus from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. After this came an embassy from the king of Parthia to him, desiring amity and confederacy, which being readily embraced by Lucullus, another was sent by him in return to the Parthian, the members of which discovered him to be a double-minded man, and to be dealing privately at the same time with Tigranes, offering to take part with him upon condition Mesopotamia were delivered up to him, which as soon as Lucullus understood, he resolved to pass by Tigranes and Mithridates as antagonists, already overcome, and to try the power of Parthia by leading his army against them, thinking it would be a glorious result thus in one current of war, like an athlete in the game, to throw down 3 kings one after another, and successfully to deal as a conqueror with 3 of the greatest powers under heaven. He sent therefore unto Pontus, to Sarmatius and his colleagues, bidding them bring the army thence, and join with him in his expedition out of Godain. The soldiers there, however, who had been restive and unruly before, now openly displayed their mutinous temper. No manner of entreaty or force availed with them, but they protested and cried out that they would stay no longer even there, but would go away and desert Pontus, the news of which, when reported to Lucullus, did no small harm to the soldiers about him, who were already corrupted with wealth and plenty, and desirous of ease, and on hearing the boldness of the others, they called them men, and declared they themselves ought to follow their example, for the actions which they had done did now well deserve release from service and repose. Upon these and worse words, Lucullus gave up the thoughts of invading Parthia, and in the height of summertime went against Tigranes. Passing over Taurus, he was filled with apprehension at the greenness of the fields before him. So long is the season deferred in this region by the coldness of the air, but nevertheless he went down, and twice or thrice, putting to flight the Armenians who dared to come out against him, he plundered and burnt their villages, and seizing on the provision designed for Tigranes, reduced his enemies to the necessity which he had feared for himself. But when, after doing all he could to provoke the enemy to fight, by drawing entrenchments round their camp, and by burning the country before them, he could by no means bring them to venture out, after their frequent defeats before, he rose up and marched to Artaxata, the royal city of Tigranes, where his wives and young children were kept, judging that Tigranes would never suffer that to go without the hazard of a battle. It is related that Hannibal, the Carthaginian, after the defeat of Antiochus by the Romans, coming to Artaxerxes, the king of Armenia, pointed out to him many other matters to his advantage, and observing the great natural capacities and pleasantness of the site, then, lying unoccupied and neglected, drew a model of a city for it, and bringing Artaxerxes thither, showed it to him, and encouraged him to build, at which the king, being pleased and desiring him to oversee the work, erected a large and stately city, which was called after his own name, and made metropolis of Armenia. And in fact, when Lucullus proceeded against it, Tigranes no longer suffered it, but came with his army, and on the 4th day set down by the Romans the river Arsanius, lying between them, which of necessity Lucullus must pass in his march to Artaxata. Lucullus after sacrifice to the entities, as if victory were already obtained. That's how we should perform their rituals. I don't know why the screen's dim. Carried over his army, having 12 cohorts in the first division in front, the rest being disposed in the rear to prevent the enemies enclosing them, for there were many choice horse drawn up against him. In the front stood the Mardian horse, archers, and Iberians with long spears, in whom being the most warlike Tigranes more confided than in other of his foreign troops, but nothing of moment was done by them. For though they skirmished with the Roman horse at a distance, they were not able to stand when the foot came up to them, but being broken and flying on both sides, drew the horse in pursuit after them. Though these were routed, yet Lucullus was not without alarm when he saw the cavalry about Tigranes with great bravery and in large numbers coming upon him. He recalled his horse from pursuing, and he himself first of all, when the best of men engaged the Satrapenians who were opposite him, and before ever they came to close fight, routed them with the mere terror of 3 kings in battle against him. Mithridates of Pontus fled away the most shamefully, being not so much as able to endure the shout of the Romans. The pursuit reached a long way, and all through the night the Romans slew and took prisoners, and carried off spoils and treasure, till they were weary. Livy says there were more taken and destroyed in the first battle, but in the second men of greater distinction. Lucullus, flushed and animated by this victory, determined to march on into the interior and there complete his conquest for the barbarians, but winter weather came on, contrary to expectation, as early as the autumnal equinox, with storms and frequent snows, and even in the most clear days, hoar frost and ice, which made the waters scarcely drinkable for the horses by their exceeding coldness, and scarcely passable through the ice breaking and cutting the horses' sinews. The country, for the most part, being quite uncleared, with difficult passes and much wood, kept them continually wet, the snow falling thickly on them as they marched in the day, and the ground that they lay upon at night being damp and watery. After the battle they followed not Lucullus many days before they began to be refractory, first of all entreating and sending the tribunes to him, but presently they tumultuously gathered together and made a shouting all night long in their tents, a plain sight of a mutinous army. But Lucullus is earnestly entreating them, desiring them to have patience till they took the Armenian Carthage and overturned the work of their enemy. They didn't say back then. Overturned the work of their enemy, meaning Hannibal. But when he could not prevail, he led them back, and crossing Taurus by another road, came into the fruitful and sunny country of Magdania, where there was a great and populous city, by the barbarians called Nisibis, by the Greeks Antioch of Magdania. This was defended by Goras, brother of Tigranes, with the dignity of governor, and by the engineering skill and dexterity of Callimachus, the same who so much annoyed the Romans at Amisus, Lucullus, however, brought his army up to it, and laying close siege in a short time, took it by storm. He used Guras, who surrendered himself kindly, but gave no attention to Callimachus, although he offered to make discovery of hidden treasure, commanding him to be kept in chains, to be punished for firing the city of Amisus, which had disappointed his ambition of showing favor and kindness to the Greeks. Here too, one would imagine fortune had attained and fought with Lucullus, but afterwards, as if the wind had failed of a sudden, he did all things by force, and as it were against the grain, and showed certainly the conduct and patience of a wise captain, but in the results met with no fresh honor of reputation, and indeed by bad success and vain embarrassments with his soldiers, he came within a little of losing even what he had before. He himself was not the least cause of all this, being far from inclined to seek popularity with the mass of the soldiers, and more ready to think any indulgence shown to them an invasion of his own authority. But what was worst of all, he was naturally unsociable to his great officers in commission with him, despising others, and thinking them worthy of nothing in comparison with himself. These faults, we are told, he had with all his many excellences. He was of a large and noble person, an eloquent speaker and a wise counselor, both in the forum and in the camp. Celeste says the soldiers were ill affected to him from the beginning of the war, because they were forced to keep the field 2 winters at Cyzicus and afterwards at Amisus. Their other writers also vexed them, for they either spent them in an enemy's country, or else were confined to their tents in the open field among their confederates. For Lucullus not so much as once went into a Greek confederate town with his army. To this ill affection abroad, the tribunes yet more contributed at home, invidiously accusing Lucullus as one who, for empire and riches, prolonged the war, holding, it might also be said, under his sole power, Cilicia, Asia, Bithynia, Paphlagonia, Pontus, Armenia, all as far as the river Thasis, and, now of late, had plundered the royal city of Tigranes, as if he had been commissioned not so much to subdue as to strip kings. This is what we are told was said by Lucius Quintius, one of the prators, at whose instance, in particular, the people determined to send one who should succeed Lucullus in his province, and voted also to relieve many of the soldiers under him from further service. Now, I personally side with the opinion that those who fight wars of conquest are cursed, in that conquesting in the defense of others and yourself, and that's a different story. But seldom does the people of the own nation sit back and go, "Oh, hey, you keep, you've been conquering people. How dare you conquer people?" Besides these evils, which most of all prejudiced Lucullus, was Publius Claudius, an insolent man, very vicious and bold, brother to Lucullus's wife, a woman of bad conduct, with whom Claudius was himself suspected of criminal intercourse, being then in the army under Lucullus, but not in as great authority as he expected, for he would fain have been the chief of all, but on account of his character was postponed to many. He ingratiated himself secretly with the Fimbrian troops, and stirred them up against Lucullus, using fair speeches to them, who of old had been used to be flattered in such a manner. These were those whom Fimbria before had persuaded to kill the consul Flaccus, and choose him their leader. And so they listened not unwillingly to Claudius, and called him the soldier's friend, for the concern he professed for them, and the indignation he expressed at the prospect that there must be no end of wars and toils, but in fighting with all the nations, and wandering through all the world, they must wear out their lives, receiving no other reward for their service than to guard the carriages and camels of Lucullus, laden with gold and precious goblets, while as for Pompey's soldiers, they were all citizens, living safe at home, with their wives and children, on fertile lands, or in towns, and that not after driving Mithridates and Tigranes into wild deserts, and overturning the royal cities of Asia, but after having merely reduced exiles in Spain, or fugitive slaves in Italy. Nay, if indeed we must never have an end to fighting, should we not rather reserve the remainder of our bodies and souls for a general who will reckon his chiefest glory to be the wealth of his soldiers? By such practices the army of Lucullus, being corrupted, neither followed him against Tigranes nor against Mithridates, when he now at once returned into Pontus out of Armenia, and was recovering his kingdom, but under pretense of the winter, sat idle in Corduene every minute, expecting either Pompey or some other general to succeed Lucullus. But when news came that Mithridates had defeated Fabius and was marching against Sonatius and Triarius, out of shame they followed Lucullus. Triarius, ambitiously aiming at victory before ever Lucullus came to him, though he was then very near, was defeated in a great battle, in which it is said that above 7,000 Romans fell, among whom were 150 centurions and 24 tribunes, and that the camp itself was taken. Lucullus, coming up a few days after, concealed Triarius from the search of the angry soldiers. But when Mithridates declined battle and waited for the coming of Tigranes, who was then on his march with great forces, he resolved before they joined their forces to turn once more and engage with Tigranes. But in the way, the mutinous Fimbrians deserted their ranks, professing themselves released from service by a decree, and that Lucullus, the provinces being allotted to others, had no longer any right to command them. There was nothing beneath the dignity of Lucullus which he did not now submit to bear, entreating them one by one, from tent to tent, going up and down humbly in tears, and even taking some, like a suppliant, by the hand. But they turned away from his salutes, and threw down their empty purses, bidding him engage alone with the enemy, as he alone made advantage of it. At length, by the entreaty of the other soldiers, the Fimbrians, being prevailed upon, consented to tarry that summer under him. But if during that time no enemy came to fight them, to be free, Lucullus of necessity was forced to comply with this, or else to abandon to the country the barbarians. He kept them indeed with him, but without urging his authority upon them, nor did he lead them out to battle, being contented if they should but stay with him, though he then saw Cappadocia wasted by Tigranes, and Mithridates again triumphing, whom not long before he reported to the Senate to be wholly subdued, and commissioners were now arrived to settle the affairs of Pontus, as if all had been quietly in his possession. But when they came, they found him not so much as master of himself, but contemned and derided by the common soldiers, who arrived at that height of insolence against their general, that at the end of summer they put on their armor and drew their swords and defied their enemies, then absent and gone off a long while before, and with great outcries and waving their swords in the air, they quitted the camp, proclaiming that the time was expired in which they promised to stay with Lucullus. The rest were summoned by letter from Pompey to come and join him, he by the favor of the people and by flattery of their leaders having been chosen general of the army against Mithridates and Tigranes, though the Senate and the nobility all thought that Lucullus was injured, having those put over his head who succeeded rather to his triumph than to his commission, and that he was not so truly deprived of his command as of the glory he had deserved in his command, which he was forced to yield to another. It was yet more of just matter of pity and indignation to those who were present, for Lucullus remained no longer master of rewards or punishments for any action done in the war, neither would Pompey suffer any man to go to him, or pay any respect to the orders and arrangements he made with advice of his 10 commissioners, but expressly issued edicts to the contrary, and could not be obeyed by reason of his greater power. Friends, however, on both sides thought it desirable to bring them together, and they met in the village of Galatia and saluted each other in a friendly manner, with congratulations on each other's successes. Lucullus was the elder, but Pompey the more distinguished by his more numerous commands and his 2 triumphs. Both had rods dressed with laurel carried before them for their victories, and as Pompey's laurels were withered with passing through hot and droughty countries, Lucullus's lictors courteously gave Pompey's some of the fresh and green ones which they had, which Pompey's friends counted a good omen, as indeed of a truth Lucullus's actions furnished the honors of Pompey's command. The interview, however, did not bring them to any amicable agreement. They parted even less friends than they met. Pompey repealed all the acts of Lucullus and drew off his soldiers, and left him no more than 1,600 for his triumph, and even those unwilling to go with him, so wanting was Lucullus, either through natural constitution or adverse circumstances, in that one first and a most important requisite of general, which he had but added to his other many and remarkable virtues, his fortitude, vigilance, wisdom, justice. The Roman emperor had not Euphrates for its boundary, but the utmost ends of Asia and the Hyrcanian Sea, and other nations were then disabled by the late conquest of Tigranes, and the power of Parthia had not in Lucullus's time shown itself so formidable as Crassus afterwards found it, nor had as yet gained the consistency, being crippled by wars at home and on its frontiers, and unable even to make head against the encroachments of the Armenians. And Lucullus, as it was, seems to me, through others' agency, to have done Rome greater harm than he did her advantage by his own, for the trophies in Armenia near the Parthian frontier, and Tigranokerta and Eusebius, and the great wealth brought from thence to Rome, with the captive crown of Tigranes carried in triumph, all helped to pull up Crassus, as if the barbarians had been nothing else but spoil and booty, and he, falling among the Parthian archers, soon demonstrated that Lucullus's triumphs were not beholden to the inadvertency and effeminacy of his enemies, but to his own courage and conduct. But of this afterwards. Lucullus, upon his return to Rome, found his brother Marcus accused by Caius Memmius for his acts as quaestor, done by Sulla's orders, and on his acquittal, Memmius changed the scene and animated the people. Against Lucullus himself, urging them to deny him a triumph for appropriating the spoils and prolonging the war, and in this great struggle the nobility and chief men went down, and mingling in person among the tribes, with much entreaty and labor, scarce at length, and prevailed upon them to consent to his triumph, the pomp of which proved not so wonderful or so wearisome with the length of the procession and the number of things carried in it, but consisted chiefly in vast quantities of arms and machines of the king's, with which he adorned the Flammian circus, a spectacle by no means despicable. In his progress there passed by a few horsemen in heavy armor, 10 chariots, armed with scythes, 60 friends and officers of the king's, and 110 brazen-beaked ships of war, which were conveyed along with them a golden image of Mithridates 6 feet high, a shield set with precious stones, and 20 loads of silver vessels, and 32 of golden cups, armor, and money, all carried by men, besides which 8 mules were laden with golden couches, 56 with bullion, and 107 with coin silver, little less than 2,700,000 pieces. There were tablets also with inscriptions stating what moneys he gave Pompey for prosecuting the Piratic War, what he delivered into the treasury, and what he gave to every soldier, which was 950 drachmas each, after all which he nobly feasted the city and adjoining villages are Vici. Being divorced from Claudia, a desolate and wicked man, he married Servilia, sister to Cato. This also proved an unfortunate match, for she only wanted one of all of Claudia's vices, the criminality she was accused of with her brothers. Out of reverence to Cato, he, for a while, connived at her impurity and immodesty, but at length dismissed her. Yeah, it's very important to not marry for mere status things. When the Senate expected great things from him, hoping to find in him a check to the usurpations of Pompey, and that with the greatness of his station and credit he would come forward as the champion of the nobility, he retired from business and abandoned public life, either because he saw the state to be in a difficult and diseased condition, or, as others say, because he was as great as he could well be, and inclined to a quiet and easy life, after those many labors and toils which had ended with him so far from fortunately. There are those who highly commend his change of life, saying that he thus avoided the rock on which Marius split, for he, after the great and glorious deeds of his Cimbrian victories, was not contented to retire upon his honors, but out of an insatiable desire of glory and power, even in his old age, headed a political party against young men, and let himself fall into miserable actions, and yet more miserable sufferings, better in like manner, they say, had it been for Cicero, after Catiline's conspiracy, to have retired and grown old, and for Scipio after his Numantine and Carthaginian conquest, to have set down contented, for the administration of public affairs has, like other things, its proper term, and statesmen, as well as wrestlers, will break down when strength and youth fail, but Crassus and Pompey, on the other hand, laughed to see Lucullus abandoning himself to pleasure and expense, as if luxurious living were not a thing that as little became his years as government of affairs at home or of an army abroad. And indeed, Lucullus's life, like the old comedy, presents us at the commencement with acts of policy and of war, at the end offering nothing but good eating and drinking, feastings and revellings, and mere play, for I give no higher name to his sumptuous buildings, porticos, and baths, still less to his paintings and sculptures, and all his industry about these curiosities, which he collected with vast expense, lavishly bestowing all the wealth and treasure which he got in the war upon them, insomuch that even now, with all the advance of luxury, the Lucullian gardens are counted the noblest the emperor has. Tibero the Stoic, when he saw his buildings at Naples, where he suspended the hills upon vast tunnels, brought in the sea for moats and fish ponds round his house, and built pleasure houses in the waters, called him Xerxes in a gown. He had also fine seats, and Tusculum belvederes, and large open balconies for men's apartments, and porticos to walk in, where Pompey, coming to see him, blamed him for making a house which would be pleasant in summer, but uninhabitable in winter, whom he answered with a smile, You think me then less provident than cranes and storks, not to change my home with the season? When a praetor, with great expense and pains, was preparing a spectacle for the people, and asked him to lend him some purple robes for the performers in a chorus, he told him he would go home and see, and if he had got any, he would let him have them, and the next day, asking how many he wanted, and being told that 100 would suffice, bade him to take twice as many. On which the poet Horace observes that a house is but a poor one where the valuables unseen and unthought of do not exceed all those that meet the eye.